Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are checking out the next part of the Siege of Vraks. This is called The Defenders, so I assume it's looking at the Cardinals' forces on Vraks that are standing up to the Death Korps of Krieg, which seems like sort of a reckless decision, but recklessness has never stopped anything else in 40k, so why should it stop this? But before we get started, check it out. New shirts are in. You can rep chaos, right, with the Corpse Emperor of Mankind. Right? If you're into that. I mean, not that you should be, but maybe you are. And maybe you want the Corpse Emperor of Mankind on your shirt. All right. Anyway, links down below. Be sure to check it out, and let's get into it.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vraks. Today we are going to have a look at the Vraksian defenders under the command of the apostate Cardinal. Prior to his rebellion, the planet of Vraks, being a fortress and armory world, was defended primarily by a PDF garrison, which also went by the name of the Garrison Auxilia. This formation was the broad equivalent to any PDF you can find across the galaxy, a standard planetary defense force that would be considered inferior in quality, training, equipment, and standards to the regiments of the Imperial Guard. The role of pretty much any PDF, including the Garrison Auxilia, is that of a second-line defense formation. Their job is to simply hold out until an Imperial Guard response force can be dispatched to lift any form of siege placed upon the system. Seeing as they are primarily a second-line formation, they are not equipped as well as the Imperial Guard. They will usually not have access to lasguns, and they will usually not have access to personal communication devices. In many cases, squads might only have one-way communication, being able to receive orders, but not being able to speak back to their commanding officers.
That's one of the most ridiculous things to me, because literally here in the 20th century, everyone has at least ICOM two-way radios. Even the Taliban would have like ICOMs that they would use. And of course, they weren't able to encrypt them. We could listen to them at any time, but you would need a translator. And often they spoke in a sort of euphemism or code, or would intentionally be very vague. Like, hey, I need you to go back to where you were before, right? But it's still two-way communication, and the ability to communicate among your units is pretty fundamental to military discipline. The other thing that's interesting to me is that in the U.S. military, right, we have a really large reserve component. That is the reserves and the National Guard. And it's true, the reserve is not quite as well funded, at least within the Army, as the active duty Army, but there is I'm going to say a stereotype of the reserves as being kind of a joke. And I think for a lot of support units, that might be the case, right? A lot of those people are ones who don't have a particular affinity for military service, but are instead just looking for the great benefits and the extra paycheck, which, by the way, if you want the cheapest, highest quality healthcare in the U.S., period, the Army Reserve is a way to get it with, like, 1 weekend a month. Again, I'm not a recruiter. I was in for about 2 years, and then I got out when I got my real job after grad school. But my brother recently had a kid, and he's like, in total, I think maybe he paid like, I'm going to say I think it was like under $500. He might not have even paid anything when his kid was born, right? By comparison, the average person with insurance pays, I think, like $5,000 to $10,000. So definitely worth looking into if you have, a desire to serve anyway. But that being said, the reserve component's combat arms are, in some ways, in my experience, in some ways equal to, or sometimes even better than the regular line units of the U.S. military. No, I'm sure forces like the 82nd Airborne and the Ranger Regiment, right? They're a cut above. But I served with a number of reserve units in Afghanistan, or National Guard like infantry units, and they were outstanding. One, because most of them had white collar professional jobs and just loved serving in the military, right? They just loved being tankers or being infantrymen or being artillery, right? They just really, and it's something that they couldn't get anywhere else, and they just loved it, right? They also, because the National Guard promotes a little slower, and a lot of guys, they don't really punish you for not seeking promotion. You would have these very, very seasoned leaders. So you would have a company commander, for example, who had 3 deployments, and one of those previous deployments was as the company commander. So not only was he an expert at the company level operations, but he knew for example, his platoon leaders, or he knew his squad leaders on a really, really intimate level. He would know their quirks. He knew their experiences. He knew who was trained in this and who was trained in that. And I saw the same thing. I would see squad leaders who would say, oh yeah, I've been to 6 different courses, right? They'd be like, I had one who was like, oh yeah, I actually went to sniper school 2 years ago, and 3 years before that, I actually did a 2-week JTAC course, so I can call fixed wing aircraft fires. And he was like, and I also was like a mechanic, a heavy wheeled vehicle mechanic in my civilian job, so if vehicles go down, I can help patch them up. And I was like, you're like a super soldier, like, and you're a part-timer, so it's interesting again that to see. I think that's unique, honestly, to the U.S. military, to have these reserve component folks who bring so much to the table. It's also sort of interesting that on the officer side of the house, I would regularly encounter people in the reserves who brought skills that the military would need but couldn't get in-house. An example is there were several corrections officers, right? Something that the military has a very small set of folks who specialize in corrections and detention, but most of the military's detention capacity is in their reserve, or their reserve component, because those are guys who you can, who get up every day and do correction operations, and then just so happens the Army keeps them on speed dial. Same with highly specialized roles, like I knew a flight surgeon, right, who was an ER doctor in a major urban area, and he was a full bird colonel and would come, 2 days a week. Basically, the Army kept him on speed dial, and he joked, he was like, yeah, he was so good, right, because again, he was doing emergency medicine every single day, that folks like the Navy SEALs and Army Rangers would actually put him on orders for less than 30 days just to support specific operations because they wanted him. They're like, hey, we want you because you've worked with us before, because you're that good, and because the truth is, Army doctors, they're good, but they serve a population in a military base, right? A well-trained population, again, that just doesn't have the level of like interpersonal violence that you sometimes see in like a major urban area. So again, I always think it's interesting that there's an old stereotype of reserve elements are worse than active elements. And that's true, I think, in a lot of countries, but it's not all that true in the United States. Not universally. Again, support units, okay, I've had enough bad experiences, but yeah, just something interesting.
And in other cases, platoons and infantry formations might have no communication equipment whatsoever, but rather be expected to hold fixed positions which itself contain some form of communication, like a bunker landline, for example. This lower level of equipment is maintained for 2 reasons. One, because the Imperium is not so wealthy that it wishes to waste resources on second-line formations, and secondly, once you have a PDF garrison force, they will, rather inevitably, be made up of citizens from said local planets, and locals have a nasty habit of putting their own needs before that of the wider Imperium. As such, it can be very beneficial indeed to ensure that other Imperial Guard regiments will have a decided advantage over any locals that they might be sent to chastise and teach them about their greater duty to the Imperium as a whole. And in broad strokes, the Vraksian garrison auxilia did not deviate from this doctrine. They were a second-line formation, however, they were stationed on an armory world, which meant that any shortcomings they may have experienced in terms of equipment could easily be made up for simply by looting the armories they were once ordered to guard. Thusly, any potential advantage the Imperial invaders might have had over the garrison auxilia in terms of equipment was more or less nullified. However, the garrison auxilia would not be anywhere near as well trained as an Imperial Guard regiment. In addition to this, their officers would not have received training in large unit engagements, nor would they have any personal experience in organizing their troops on a larger scale. Anyone who might have had said training or experience had been cleansed during the uprising, and Deacon Mamoon had taken overall command of the armed forces in Card.
You know, one of the things that's interesting, and I've talked about this in other videos, is that often in many other countries, and actually this is true in the U.S. as well, is that the reserve component is often a place where experienced soldiers that kind of age out of frontline duty will go to continue to serve in some capacity. In World War I, Germany famously actually integrated their reserve troops into their frontline formations. And this was seen as really innovative at the time, because the common belief was that while you had a professional officer corps, your typical frontline soldier was optimally 18 to 24 years old, unmarried, no children, right? Because they were believed to be the most physically fit, and their lack of families enabled them to focus entirely on combat. However, that was just sort of discounting the patriotism of their older brethren, right? In many cases, you know, Germany said, hey, we need all the manpower we can get. So even those frontline troops, when they age out and they move into the reserve component, right, where they will continue to drill occasionally at local armories until they reach, I think, 40 or 50 years of age, Germany said, hey, we're going to call up these reserves and we are going to put them in the front line. And lo and behold, the German troops weren't slowed down by their reserve components at all. The reservists fought just as well, right? Fought just as valiantly, and in a lot of cases, their maturity as soldiers, right? Because they had served a full term, had that full set of experiences, right? Some of them may have even seen previous combat if they were on the older side, but that proved to be such a beneficial trait for those active duty soldiers who were very fit, but also very young and not seasoned, and there's something to be said for just the decision making that someone who has led a long, I'm going to say, has gotten more years of experience under their belt. You know, I would be really curious, right? I think about myself now as having, since I've left active duty, I obviously spent some time in the reserves, got a master's degree, lived overseas in Europe and in South America, and, started this YouTube channel, had several other businesses. And all that, I would wonder now if I was to come back onto active duty, like my perspective would for sure be different. It would be way, way, way different about how things are done, how organizations function, how cultures work together to be mission effective. And I'd be curious, I wish I could be a fly on the wall in those World War II units to see if those older reservists who had served time in their militaries, gone off, lived, civilian lives, and then came back into their militaries. So it's telling to me that the Astra Militarum doesn't do that for their PDFs, right? Older guardsmen who survive a campaign or who complete their term of service logically may want to get rotated back to their home countries to serve in their PDF, because that would make their PDF more effective. But as Arch says, having an ineffective PDF is something that the Imperium feels is important.
Cardinal Zafe instead. As such, the auxiliary garrison would in all due likelihood be unable to carry out any kind of complex, large-scale operation or maneuvers. However, they would be perfectly well suited and experienced in manning a static defense line, since that was the role they had been trained for and recruited for. There were not, however, relatively speaking, all that many of them. The garrison auxilia would be unlikely to number much more than a couple 100,000 strong, with the rest of the planet's defense forces numbers being made up by a third line formation, the Labor Auxilia. This group was probably 2 to 3 times the size of the garrison auxilia, and was made up of part-time soldiers recruited from amongst Vraks's considerably sized Labor Corps. These would have volunteered for limited military service in return for larger rations of food and mildly improved living conditions. Under normal circumstances, the Labor Auxilia would be granted minimal military training to bring them up to the rough equivalent of a militia formation, where you would have large formations, possibly as large as platoon-sized, being commanded by a single garrison auxilia officer. In terms of equipment, they would be granted the usage of small arms only. They would not be allowed to possess any form of heavy weaponry or vehicles. This was due to the simple fact that once the external enemy...
So this is interesting. Again, in the United States, believe it or not, we have, in some states, a sort of force that exists below that of the National Guard and Reserve, right? You have the active military, National Guard and Reserve, and then below that, some states have, they call them state defense forces or state auxiliary, and these are often totally volunteer forces that do almost no weapons training, and they function, as I imagine these folks function, as a deployable, trainable force that can provide basic, basic labor for in the event of an emergency. These would be roles like filling sandbags, directing traffic, distributing food or water, organizing people in need. Very, very simple functions that it's actually surprising how essential those can be in a crisis. I've seen a lot of instances in big national level crises where the most needed roles are actually just simple labor that can be done by a trusted person. Literally, watch this group of people to make sure no one gets hurt. Tell people that they can't go into this area. Pass out sandwiches in this line, right? It sounds silly until you realize just how hard it can be to get enough manpower to handle these sort of operations. And so having a auxiliary like this, truthfully, what I think would be more logical is, manning static positions with small arms, perhaps. To me, the best use of them, they're already laborers. They're already organized as laborers. I would tell them to be fighting position construction teams, ammo haulers, stretcher bearers, anything that involved just like grindy, annoying, heavy labor, so that the fighting forces, every single person, every single trained fighting soldier can fight, right? So that no one has to get diverted to some other function.
Was defeated, the Labor Auxilia would be asked to turn over their weapons, disband, and go back to providing what was in all due essentiality slave labor as part of the Labor Corps. And as you can probably imagine, they might be hesitant to do so if they thought they had a fighting chance. Thusly, depriving them of access to any form of heavy weaponry was a way to ensure that they wouldn't get any such creative ideas. But of course, these were anything but the usual circumstances. In this case, the Vraksian Labour Corps was one of the fundaments upon which the Cardinal had launched his revolution. They had been the first to rise up, and he had also recruited vast quantities of Frateris militia from amongst their numbers. He would probably have far less to fear from a general uprising from them than the original owners of Vraks would. Not to mention, the Labour Corps undoubtedly knew that if the Imperials reclaimed the world, they would be far from above suspicion. In all due likelihood, the entire Labour population would, best case scenario, experience severely tightened conditions upon their living standards, to make sure that they would never think about doing anything silly like supporting a rebel preacher ever again, but far more likely, they would simply be eradicated. This then takes away one of the primary problems with the Labour Auxiliary, the fact that you simply cannot trust the little buggers to actually fight the enemy with everything they've got, since now they very much so have a vested interest in resisting their invaders. And of course, by extension...
This is maybe emblematic of one of the Imperium's biggest problems, is that people fight harder to protect a way of life they view as fundamentally good. And again, the classic example being our World War I Germany. People really thought that at the time that young, fit, full-time soldiers were the best and everyone else was secondary. But in fact, the people that had built a life for themselves and then had a really strong sense that that way of life was under threat, in fact, fought harder. And as we see, the idea that there's this unreliable, when you have people whose lives are so miserable, that why would they defend a country or world or system that they hate, that is pure suffering for them? Of course they're not going to defend it, right? They're going to need to be coerced. You're going to need to have all these commissars threatening to shoot people. And it actually becomes self-defeating, right? You're better off enabling people to view their home country and their home way of life as being worthy of defending. And that way, you don't need to have quite the same level of, I'm going to say supervision, but ensuring their loyalty, etc.
This also meant that they could now be trusted, and most importantly of all, that they could be trusted with the heavy weaponry. There was, of course, however, still a question of training. Their initial training at the hands of the auxiliary garrison had been rudimentary at best. They were trained how to operate an autogun, more or less, and perhaps how to clean and maintain one, but beyond that, they had very little in the way of official training. No squad cohesion, no communications training, no tactics training, no coordination training. They would not have even the faintest understanding of any sort of military concept. Ideas like mutually supporting fire, for example. Suppression, the idea of calling down an artillery bombardment. They would know next to nothing about any of this, because they didn't need to know any of that. All they were needed to do was sit in a trench line and fire their weapons in the general direction of the enemy. Teaching them anything more than that would not only be a waste of time as far as the local imperial governor was concerned, it was also downright risky. Giving ideas such as squad cohesion, or even squad belonging to slaves, well, that has backfired in the past, hasn't it? But once again, since that wasn't a problem at the moment, or at the very least not the most pressing problem, they could be granted some level of training by the auxiliary garrison. Now, this is kind of like the blind leading the blind, since they as well didn't have all that much in the way of training, but it was certainly better than nothing. And the role of the Labour Auxilia wouldn't really change that much. They were still expected to man stationary, prepared defensive positions and fire their weapons at the enemy. It's just that now, said weapons would include some heavier variants as well, and due to that, they could be used to replace the garrison auxilia.
I mean, it is kind of interesting, to me at least, that the skills expected of an individual soldier have gone up tremendously in the 21st century. One of the things that's most common is, questions, how has recruit training changed from, say, World War II to today? And the answer is, in terms of scheduling and that sort of thing, it hasn't changed a ton, right? Some people say that it was harder in the past, and it was certainly more abusive in the past, right? Instructors would hit recruits and demean them, and that was seen as being pretty essential. But the skills they were trying to impart in these recruits were really limited. And often recruits would be physically pretty inept, right? The idea of physical education as part of regular schooling was absolutely unheard of. That was a Cold War development in the United States, at least. And instead, you were more likely to see these basically rail-thin kids who had grown up, probably food insecure, enter the military, oftentimes with, maybe some basic literacy skills. And the military realistically was like, okay, we can teach these folks to engage the enemy with a bayonet, engage the enemy with a rifle, engage the enemy with grenades, and in specific cases, some of them using other small arms or machine guns, BARs, that sort of thing, or mortars and indirect fire. So you ended up with this very basic, and in terms of medical care, it was like how to apply a bandage, right? Nowadays, we expect the military, the average private, to arrive in their unit able to operate their radio, use proper radio protocol, call in things like a 9-line medevac, understand how to read a map, understand how to find themselves on a map and get the grid coordinates, be able to operate their small arms or their individual weapon, crew-served weapons such as a 50 cal or 249, at least achieve some level of familiarity with them, and perform a fairly in-depth level of field medical care, including using a bandage, a tourniquet, assessing a casualty for airway, breathing, broken bones, splinting a wound, etc., etc. In addition to, of course, all the military drill and ceremony and the knowledge of military protocol. So the level of knowledge that we expect our trainees to enter the force with is much higher than it's probably ever been. And that's not even including specialized training that can sometimes be 6 months to a year. So all this to say that it's not that uncommon in history to have extremely low knowledge troops, right, be expected to fulfill very rudimentary functions like go where you're told, engage targets, here's how to put a bandage on yourself when the enemy shoots you.
To a greater degree, which would allow the better trained and better led troops of the Garrison Auxilia to be freed up for other tasks. So then we have the two primary military sources of defenders for Vraks, the Garrison Auxilia and the Labor Auxilia. In all due likelihood, recruitment into the Labor Auxilia would have risen drastically after the Cardinal took over, both through good old-fashioned incentives and just a little bit of coercion. In turn, the numbers of the Garrison Auxilia would also, in all due likelihood, have grown a fair bit, as they would take in the most skilled and promising member from the Labor Auxilia and train them up to be parts of their formations. Far easier, after all, to integrate limited numbers of Labor Corps Auxilia than train them all up to the standards of the Garrison Auxilia. But whilst these two forces, the Garrison and the Labor Auxilia, represented the main military source of manpower, they were not the only ones. Another potential source of manpower would be the members of the Munitorum and Administratum, or, well, ex-members at this point if they wanted to live anyways. In this case, the problem with the Labor Corps had kind of been inverted. Whilst the Imperial garrison was in charge, the Labour Auxilia were considered fairly untrustworthy, and only to be armed in extreme circumstances. Now, however, they were a relatively trustworthy source of manpower, whilst the members of the Departamento Monitorum and Administratum must have been viewed as very suspect sources of manpower indeed. Now, surely, a fair few of them would already have been vocal supporters of the Cardinal, and those who weren't already vocal supporters, well, again, if they knew what was best for them, they had better become vocal supporters of him rather quickly. This group would also be a relatively small portion of the population, and as such, even if the Cardinal chose to more or less ignore it in military terms, he probably wouldn't lose out on too much in the way of manpower, and until the situation got somewhat chaotic and just a wee bit desperate, the Cardinal would be likely to try and avoid tapping this manpower reserve as long as possible, since once they were face to face with their old Imperial brethren, they might be tempted to change their tone somewhat. A considerably more loyal source of manpower might be those from off-world. The Cardinal had of course drawn to him a rather considerable following of pilgrims and other assorted followers, many of which had already formed into armed bands and had, well, whilst not necessarily combat experience, they certainly did know how to bludgeon one another violently across the head, which is certainly something. Once again, it would not be...
I mean, anytime you have already organized groups willing to commit violence, you've bought your, that's always an asset, right? If you're, again, an authoritarian like the Cardinal. And there are certainly roles for these sort of folks. And again, if they already have an organizational structure, they already have manpower, and they already have enthusiasm, military skills are the last and perhaps easiest thing to add to the puzzle. The hardest thing is probably equipment, but obviously the Cardinal has solved that problem. What's also interesting is their organizational choices. And it's interesting to me because what many militaries do, these are usually countries with very small militaries, is that they maintain a large stock of weapons of all sorts, much greater than they have the personnel to operate. And the idea there is that they maintain a professional corps of soldiers that, in the event that the likelihood of a conflict starts to rise, that professional corps will become instructors and commanders for larger formations of draftees. So the idea is that you have a small contingent, let's say a few hundred or maybe 1,500 tank operators, or tank crew members, and a few dozen tank commanders. But in the event that your tensions rise with your neighboring country, you suddenly say, hey, we need to quintuple the size of our tank corps. So you take those active duty tankers almost to a person, and you give them a quick course in instruction, and then you have them as instructors for your new contingent of draftees who will get trained up on these tanks and then become tank crew members themselves, and they will be the first fighting force ready to meet the enemy at the front line. Of course, you may have your more active duty, better trained officers, since they take a little longer to grow, and non-commissioned officers, which also take a long time to grow. And so, they will be having some sort of leadership function, but that is how a lot of militaries explicitly plan to scale up their militaries in time of war. Of course, it assumes that there is a 6 month to a year period of tensions rising before the outbreak of actual war. In the event of a rapid strike by an already trained and prepared force, most of these countries are just going to have to depend on their allies, frequently the United States, to intervene to protect them.
The most experienced or reliable of troops, but ye certainly could not question their dedication. They had come to this world drawn by the Cardinal's words, and many of them had already joined the Frateris militia. And whilst, once again, they could not be relied upon to carry out complex maneuvers, they could be relied upon to hold a trench line until the absolute last man. Not an insignificant quality as far as a defensive siege is concerned. Then we have the fifth and final source of manpower for the Cardinal's armies, those who had previously fallen afoul of the Vraksian justice system. As mentioned in the first episode, thousands of criminals and other deviants were kept locked up nice and tight in various cells beneath the main citadel. These containment chambers had been emptied of their previous occupants and filled with the Adeptus Sororitas instead, whom were at this point undoubtedly cursing the name of their former master. Now, naturally, Vraks being essentially a penal colony, it had rather considerably sized prisons. And considering they were already somewhat at odds with the Imperium, their loyalty to the Cardinal was probably fairly solid, relatively speaking, as solid as the loyalty of an army of deranged murderers, psychopaths, and criminals could ever be, I suppose. And whilst, relatively speaking, when compared to the Labour Corps or the Auxiliary Garrison, it wouldn't make up much of a manpower pool, one should never underestimate the effect of large quantities of vicious murderers released upon the enemy. And we are still...
Again, this is a stereotype that if you are a hot-headed murderer or even a cold-blooded, unemotional killer, that you will do well in the military. Generally, if you commit a lot of interpersonal violence, you don't have a lot of strong social... Those individuals often struggle to form the really tight unit-based bonds that are required of conducting military operations, right? A squad has to work together to help each other, even in a defensive position, right? They say, oh, they're just going to get sent to the trench line and told to shoot in that direction until they die. And that may be true, but it's also true that you just can't get around the idea that the 10 to 12 people to your left and right are just going to have to help each other, right? And often it's, hey man, I'm out of water. Can I get a drink? Hey, I want a light. Do you have a match? Or does your lighter still work? Even things like, hey, I'm short of ammo. Can I get some? Hey, do you know where I can requisition some more, toilet paper? Right? These are things that just human beings do, right? When you have a challenging situation and you're already right next to somebody, you're going to form some bonds with them. But if you're a murderer, if you're someone who already engages in a lot of interpersonal violence, again, I'm using a murder as an example, but it could just be assault, could just be fraud, could just be someone without that strong, I'm going to use the word moral compass, but I'm going to say that strong sense of cooperation. You're going to see your buddy has toilet paper, and instead of sharing, you're going to go, F you, get your own. And he's going to go, no, I need some. And instead of forming being able to share what you have and become tighter and more cohesive as a unit, you're going to start fighting this dude over toilet paper, or who drank the most hooch, or, who's got the last cigarette and why won't they share it? Or you're just going to want their cigarette and you're going to kill them because you've done it before, right? So the idea that this killer instinct is somehow essential to military operations is almost universally not true.
Talking at the very least a few thousands, and probably a few tens of thousands of prisoners. And there was one particularly shiny little cherry all the way at the bottom of this piss and shit drenched pile of imprisonment and criminality. Now, you might not think that a shit-stained cherry would be particularly valuable, but in this case...
Wow. Arch is swearing. Come on, man. Gotta be advertiser friendly. Arch advertiser friendly. Oh, I cracked myself up.
The cherry was made up of several hundred psychically active individuals. Because, of course, Vraks, just like any other loyal world in the Imperium, would immediately gather up any individuals within its society suspected of being a psycher. After which, said individuals will be herded off to the deepest, darkest, assiest of prison cells at the absolute most isolated end of whatever planet they found themselves residing on. In these cells, specially constructed to hold these individuals, they will await the arrival of the Imperium's black ships, who will take them off to Terra to either be trained, if they are cooperative and safe enough, or to be granted an altogether more honourable, yet also short-term position. These psychers would of course be entirely untrained and extraordinarily dangerous. Once exposed to the world above, quite a few of them would probably have had rather severe accidents, ending in their immediate termination. Those who lived would, in all due likelihood, be utterly worthless for anything requiring subtlety. For example, they would not be able to be used as astropaths, since that requires decades of training and a complex system of interpretation. They would not be able to be used as solid battlefield psychers because, generally speaking, their control over their powers would be supremely dodgy at the best of times, and essentially turning them into little more than walking bombs at worst.
The Orc Weird Boys would like to have a word with you about just how much control and discipline you need to be a psyker on the battlefield.
Nevertheless, even a human-shaped explosive device may have its uses, and considering the potency of these devices in particular, I'm sure the Cardinal could imagine some applications for these deranged lunatics. Now, as you've probably gathered, these formations would in all due likelihood have considerable quantities of deviation within them when it comes to fighting abilities, tactics, and morale. Even within the various sources of manpower, there could be considerable discrepancies.
I mean, this is universally true of all militaries, right? Every military has their favorite formations, their most elite troopers, their sort of dregs type formations. This is extremely common.
The Labour Auxilia probably being the most obvious. Many of them had been ardent believers in the Cardinal, and had risen up to free themselves, only to be put back to work almost immediately after the Cardinal took control of the planet. That, in all due likelihood, dissuaded quite a few of them of their illusions. Even within the Garrison Auxilia, there would probably have been several of them that were in no way consulted as to their actions. Their commanders decided that they would be on the Cardinal's side, and whether or not the men under his command had even the faintest clue as to what was happening, or the potential consequences, would be very much so doubtful. The simple fact was that many of those who fought for the Cardinal on Vraks did so because they really had no other choice. The Imperials would undoubtedly simply just execute them if they were to surrender, and if they were to talk about surrendering, they would be executed by the Cardinal's disciples of Zaphon, who, after having become primarily an elite guard for the Cardinal in the early days, had now evolved into an entirely different beast, having become the Cardinal's primary means of enforcing his will upon the population.
Yeah, this is one of the things that's really interesting to me when you look throughout history, is we forget sometimes that these individuals don't all make an independent choice, not in the sense that we think of it. And it's true today as well. You know, at the end of the day, people are, and I think we see it more now than ever, right? Just how much people can adopt completely factually incorrect beliefs, not even just a bad worldview, but can form their worldview around things that are either untrue or things that are true but so divorced from context they are functionally untrue. Look at all the conspiracy theories that are floating around out there, and imagine if your government had a vested interest in promoting those conspiracies in order to enact compliance among the population. Again, what comes to my mind is, since we've been on World War I, right? This is Siege of Vraks, it's World War I themed. You can see there is a tremendous amount of propaganda that was produced. And it's fascinating to look at some of the ways that the government in the UK, because I'm an English speaker, that's the propaganda that I can most easily understand and access. The propaganda there was really fascinating. So obviously they had the appeals to patriotism and to duty. There were also exaggerated reports of German cruelty. This propaganda sought to depict the Germans as being not fully human, as being sort of animalistic. There's often propaganda posters depicting them as being sort of half apes. And this, of course, serves to create a strong sense of us versus them, and to give you a sense that to give the potential recruit a sense that their duty is to defend their civilized people against this uncivilized force, or their fully human brethren against a force that is only sort of human, right? That's fundamental to draw that strong dividing line. They also used propaganda they also used shame as a tool. The government actually encouraged young women to mock and shame men who had not completed military service. They would have the women, I believe it was like pin a like white rose of cowardice or something onto men who had not enlisted, right? And again, if you're an 18-year-old or even 16, 17-year-old, getting mocked by your female peers is tremendously emasculating. And it's a pretty filthy tactic to use on young, easily manipulated, naive children. I mean, if you are the military will draw at this day and at that time, they were drawing 16, 17, 18-year-olds. So, teenagers. It's pretty manipulative to get them to fight in World War I. So yeah, I'm always sort of I try more as I get older to recognize the fact that many people who make these sort of decisions often have so little access to information that they can't see the full context of the situation and the full options presented to them. And thanks to social and societal pressures, often ones like we talked about with the White Rose, often ones that are societal pressures that are created or exacerbated by very powerful people to serve their own ends. Again, the government of the UK needed warm bodies to throw at a war that fundamentally was happening in continental Europe. This was not a war against Britain, and the Germans never wanted to take Britain. They just wanted to knock France out of the war, sue quickly for peace, and then focus on Russia. So the fact that the UK government, right, had to go through some serious propaganda-based mental gymnastics to convince people that they were actually defending their home island from a military that didn't have the intention or even the capacity to hurt them, was, pretty disingenuous.
And more importantly, the military. They had essentially taken upon themselves the roles of political officers. Or, in this case, I suppose religious officers would be more correct. Their fundamental task, of course, being to ensure that all of the men underneath their command were appropriately aware of the religious importance of their actions, and how vital it was for the future of the Cardinal's great plans for the sector that they withstand the forces of the clearly misled and probably heretical Imperium. This duty, of course, also included within it the responsibility to stamp out any disloyal sentiments that any of the more misguided parts of the population might still harbour. To ensure they were able to carry out these duties, they had essentially limitless authority. If they decided that an individual trooper, or officer, or commander, or even general was not as dedicated to the cause as he should be, they were fully within their rights to chastise said individual with any means they deemed appropriate, including, of course, summary executions. They were also still utilized in their original role as a sort of elite honor guard for the Cardinal, both in making sure that the Cardinal remained safe from any traitorous elements within the walls, and as an elite formation of shock troops, having, of course, been given first pickings amongst the Imperial armories of Vraks. They were undoubtedly the best equipped and motivated of all of Vrax's defenders. And lastly, after talking about the various sources of manpower available, and the somewhat
Sorry, I just gotta point out that one of the more interesting stories that came out of the first Gulf War was the elite Republican Guard, right? Saddam Hussein had a particular, I want to say it was like a brigade or regiment-sized unit that was his best equipped, with his best troops, and the United States military, or the coalition military planners, really expected that the Republican Guard would prove to be a extremely tenacious opponent, right? They were almost, they believed, on par or a peer with the U.S. forces. However, when actually engaged in combat, the Republican Guard was pretty terrible. In fact, they wilted pretty easily under fire, didn't resist, didn't fight much harder than the Iraqi conscripts who surrendered en masse. And the reason is because Saddam did not reward the Republican Guard, or he did not select individuals for the Republican Guard based on military skill. He was selecting them for loyalty. His commanders were the ones, not who were the best commanders, but were the ones who were most loyal. Or, put another way, they were the ones who were the biggest brown-nosers, the ones who were fawning, the ones who were utter and complete succophants for Saddam. Often they were the right tribal group, the right ethnic group, the right religious group, and were often born in the right cities. And so what you had instead was, an elite, well-equipped guard that paraded really well, but in fact, they were actually kind of soft, right? They were sort of cowardly because they were entitled. They were paid better, fed better, lived in better conditions, and living in good conditions or being compensated appropriately is fine if you are well-trained, if you warrant it through your military skill. But when you don't have a meritocracy, when instead all you're selecting for is loyalty, you get just increasing levels of ineffectiveness as you rise through the ranks. The closer you are to the actual authoritarian leader, the more brown-nosing, succulent, leeches you end up finding. And so you actually have this government that gets less and less effective as you get closer and closer to the top. Which, of course, is why authoritarian militaries tend not to do super great.
varying quality, both in training and morale of said manpower, let us look at their equipment. The amusing fact here is that whilst Vraks was of course an armory world and contained huge quantities of equipment, most of it was of a heavier sort. Vehicles, mortars, artillery pieces, heavy bolter, fuel, ammunition, bombs, etc. There weren't actually that much in the way of individual infantryman equipment. There were limited stores of uniforms and lasguns, all of which were immediately confiscated, of course, by the disciples of Zaphen, whilst most of Vraksian defenders would have to make do with relatively simple equipment. As for uniforms, they would utilize whatever they already possessed. The Garrison Auxilia would utilize the remains of their old uniforms, the Labor Auxilia Corps would utilize their own labor garbs, and everybody else would utilize primarily civilian clothing. As for weapons and protection, the stores on Vraks contained vast quantities of second-line formation small arms, stuff like autoguns or shotguns, along with huge containers filled with ammunition for the various weapons. This meant that as far as small arms were concerned, the Imperials would have a bit of an advantage. Of course, if you get shot in the face by an autogun, you're just as dead as if you got shot in the face by a lasgun, but the lasgun does have several clear-cut advantages over the autogun. Ease of use, ease of maintenance, reliability, and ease of logistics. Now, the logistical part wouldn't be that much of a problem for the Vraksian, since, of course, they would be rather close to their own ammunition depots.
This is a really good point. Yeah, it's always a factor that it's easy and frequently happens that offensives that appear to be doing well actually just run out through their lines. This happened all the time in World War II because mechanized warfare had evolved, but logistics hadn't quite caught up. And so you would often have these decisive mechanized pushes covering, hundreds of miles as the enemy retreated. And then the tankers and vehicle operators would turn around and go, hey, what happened? Where's our fuel depot? Where's our food? And it was common to have to slow down offensives just to catch up the logistics trains. It's even more interesting that became a tactic, right? The Russians famously retreated across half of their country's territory, stretching the German lines thinner and thinner as the Germans impulsively sort of chased after them. And admittedly, the Russians were suffering defeats, but they were achieving their strategic objectives. So it's tough to argue that it was really a defeat, right? By the time the tide was finally turned, the Germans were freezing, exhausted, and low on ammunition, and had divided their troops repeatedly, trying to take multiple objectives because they felt like they were winning, because in Western Europe, right, an 80-mile advance is conquering most of your enemy's country, but 80 miles in Russia is nothing. All this to say that there's a tremendous advantage by never knowing that your supply lines are never going to get stretched out.
However, the relatively complicated construction of a autogun compared to that of a lasgun could prove to be the source of a fair bit of considerable problems amongst Vraks's defenders, seeing as most of them would essentially be complete and utter amateurs at this. An autogun requires quite a lot of maintenance to keep operational, and it also has a nasty habit of jamming in inclement weather conditions, and Vraks being constantly plagued by sudden, massive typhoon-level downpours, well, it's certainly not the perfect conditions for an autogun. And pound for pound, the lasgun is just flat out a better weapon. It's more accurate, it's got less recoil, and it's capable of delivering, at the very least, as powerful a punch as an autogun, if not an even more powerful punch, considering the specialized Lucius pattern rifles of the Death Korps of Krieg. The autogun did, however, have one advantage over the Lucius pattern utilized by the Death Korps, namely that the autogun was capable of fully automatic fire, which the Lucius pattern was not. Though even this advantage was somewhat limited in its nature. The autogun is quite heavy, quite long, not at all suited for indoor fighting, and when fired on full auto has a absolutely ridiculous recoil. It was certainly an advantage in close quarters fighting, but not perhaps as big of one as you might expect. As for protection, the Vraksian defenders would be relatively well equipped with personal body armor, although in all due likelihood not purpose-made to be used as such. The stores on Vraks contained vast quantities of plasteel, which the defenders used to create a vast array of scratch-built improvised armor plating, cuirasses, helmets, greaves, etc.
It is sort of funny to see that since the U.S. military introduced its small arms resistant body armor, right? It's ceramic plates that can stop up to like a 30-06 round. That, in 2003, right, most combat line troops would have those. And here we are, I guess 20 years later, and you can buy plates that will stop almost every assault rifle caliber round, so a mid-size round, for literally $99.99 online. They're a bit heavier, and they're just a treated steel. But it's fascinating to see the way personal protection has grown so rapidly over the past 20 years, going from a highly specialized military product outside the reach of a civilian to the point where it's something that, every single police officer, every single private security guard, every single civilian who, on tactical Instagram, God help you, veteran Instagram's full of it. But it's interesting to see the way this is scaled up, and that now anyone with $200 extra floating around can actually pick themselves up a pretty capable set of body armor.
Vraksian defenders were also equipped with some form of gas mask or rebreather apparatus. The actual proper rebreathers would be handed out to the more elite and valued troops like the Enforcers and the Disciples of Zaphon, whilst the rest were given second-line used gear or even ordered to simply procure or manufacture their own forms of breathing equipment. This gear would usually be made up of an oxygen tank, some form of crude rebreather, and some form of a gas mask. All in all, it would have been fairly crude, but it would have been enough to provide at least limited time protection against most low-grade chemical and biological threats. Against any more virulent strains of said weaponry that either they themselves or the Imperium might decide to deploy, they would have to rely upon the shelters built beneath most of their bunkers. These could be hermetically sealed and operated on their own life support system, which would render the troops inside more or less impervious to even exterminatus-grade biological weaponry, at least for a limited period of time. As for other miscellaneous equipment...
Okay, gotta say, this is one of those things that sort of bothers me, that, the Imperium obviously wanted to retain the infrastructure of the armory, and also ensure that the rebellious Cardinal and his forces were all killed. And the Imperium has no qualms about civilian casualties, which begs the question, why not soften up your target with a little, and by a little I mean a lot, of biological warfare, right? You can see it took them considerable amounts of time to get their gas masks on, and that their gas masks only provided limited protection. As we all know, that a gas mask will stop some types of chemical and biological agents that require respiration to infect, but it won't stop infections transmitted via the skin or other bodily fluids. And what's even more interesting to me is that you already have these relatively untrained troops. Why not weaken them by sending out, super cholera, super dysentery, super yellow fever? All right, why not send out these biological agents to soften up your targets for, 12 months before you launch your offensive? Again, there's only so much that a gas mask is meant for a very specific subset of NBC threats. Right. Also, if your air is breathable, you don't need a separate oxygen tank. You just need a filter.
It is reasonable to assume that the Vraksians would have access to considerable quantities of communication devices, probably even personalized vox beads, as this would be standard issue to any Imperial Guard regiment, and it would also be one of the pieces that tend to get lost or destroyed rather frequently, meaning that it would probably be stocked in considerable quantities on an armament world. Now, of course, whether or not the Vraksian defenders would actually be able to utilize said equipment, that is a different question. It's obviously better to have these communication devices than not to, but whether or not they could actually utilize them for any kind of squad-level organization or advanced tactics is somewhat questionable. And in all due likelihood, the enforcers and disciples of Zaphen would not be particularly pleased by the idea of giving all of their troopers communications devices with which they could speak to each other privately.
Okay, I gotta say, I understand the, like, concerns and the sense that, like, training is, like, decisive, but I want to point out that the Iraqi army in 2003, in the invasion of Iraq, was defeated decisively pretty quickly. And as far as we can tell, the insurgency that emerged in Iraq was actually as much Shia as it was Sunni, and the military was largely Sunni, I think. But the point is, it was organic. It was an organic insurgency that evolved. It wasn't a paramilitary group. And so, but just the constraints, right? The fact that you have to solve this problem of how do we fight the U.S. military and, of course, my rival religious sects and religious leaders and everyone else, the hundreds of other players that were involved in the Iraq War at its peak. You know, you have to, these groups evolved. They evolved really quickly and became very sophisticated in their abilities to communicate and manufacture and plan and execute operations. The level of sophistication was sometimes pretty incredible. They would release propaganda videos of them doing detailed sand table rehearsals, things that you would expect from a standard military, but they just managed to sort of home grow it from a bunch of civilians that would just had to figure out how to conduct military operations. So I think sometimes discounting the ability of people to coordinate over time and across distances, if you have a firm grasp of the terrain and you have a firm chain of command, then most people within, again, a couple of weeks can get themselves to the point where they can coordinate as a company or battalion level force. Again, especially when you don't need a ton of flexibility. You don't need to learn to do it on different terrain with different equipment. It's just not as essential.
And finally, the Vraksian defenders were likely to equip themselves with a wide variety of improvised weaponry, most of which would be close combat weapons. These various forms of melee weapons, be they swords, axes, picks, sharpened shovels, spikes, etc., would prove to be very, very valuable indeed in the kinds of close-quarters combat that very quickly could occur when fighting in the claustrophobic confines of trenches and bunker complexes. The more fortunate and favoured, such as officers or disciples of Zaphen, might also have access to purpose-built close-quarter combat weaponry looted from the Vraksian stores, such things as chainswords or even a handful of power weapons. As far as personal equipment was concerned, the Vraksian renegade would be quite outmatched by his Imperial opponent from Krieg. In an open field battle, the Krieg guardsmen would have a decided advantage over the renegade militia. However, this was of course not an open field battle. The Krieg guardsman would have to slog his way across prepared ground filled with minefields and barbed wire. The renegade would be in fortified positions, in bunkers, equipped with copious amounts of heavy weaponry. And in that department, the renegades were not inferior to their Imperial counterparts. They had access to ridiculous quantities of heavy machine guns, mortars, artillery, tanks, cannons, flamethrowers, shotguns, all manners of heavy weaponry. They could quite easily match the Imperials gun for gun in that department, and in all due likelihood, that would more than make up for their marginally inferior equipment when it came to small arms. Add on to that the advantage of well-prepared and robustly constructed defensive positions, and suddenly the battle doesn't seem anywhere near as clear-cut. The question then was whether or not the Cardinal and his lackeys could weld the various formations underneath his command into a cohesive whole, or at the very least bully them into all pulling in more or less the same direction. Only time, and this YouTube series, will tell. Until next time.
Yeah, I'm really curious because in addition to World War One, there's definitely some analogs there. The other interesting analog is the Spanish Civil War. And this is because that the Spanish Civil War was when the Spanish military, or the vast majority of the Spanish military, attempted to seize power in the country. And so the government, the democratically elected government of Spain, had to rely on informal militias. Sometimes these were actually political parties who had, we're going to say, a very active wing that would become armed and militarized. Sometimes even labor unions were asked to take up arms and join in the Republican, defense of the Republic, but later it became a formal military. But it was tremendously difficult for these various political parties, various ideologies, labor unions with different orientations to coordinate themselves sufficiently to stand against the professional military. And the truth is, actually, they probably would have done a good job, but for the fact that the Spanish nationals, or nacionalistas, is how they called themselves, they were supported by other fascist countries, such as fascist Italy and fascist Germany. So you ended up, of course, where what may have been an actual stalemate if both sides were left to their own devices became a pretty decisive victory for the Spanish nationalists, the military, because they got continual overt support from fascist governments, whereas the discombobulated, difficult to coordinate group of Spanish Republicans only received some pretty paltry help from the Soviet Union. So anyway, definitely this is set up to be a total bloodbath, and it should be fascinating to see how in lore the Death Korps of Krieg fights this fight, and how it stacks up against how you should really try to take a defensive position. But we will be checking that out next time. Be sure to stick around. Thank you so much, guys, for watching this episode. Be sure to check out the merch store. As you can see, shouting out Corpse Emperor of Mankind. We got the other shirts back there, right? And we've got lots of fun stuff on the merch store, so you should absolutely check it out. And until next time, I will see you guys later.